The next topic, topic D, is on the questions of ownership. Who owns new technologies? Who owns new organisms? How can we make sure that those systems of ownership are fair and equitable, compassionate, that the benefits of these technologies accrue to all? To talk about that, first, introducing our first speaker, Yoon-seong Lee, is Dr. Yi Ding. Dr. Ding is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of North Georgia. And then introducing our second speaker, Margaret Somerville, is Dr. Peng Jin, who is a professor of human genetics at Emory University. Thanks.
It's my great honor to introduce Professor Yoon-seong Lee. Dr. Yoon-seong Lee is a professor in the Department of Forensic Medicine at the Seoul National University College of Medicine. His interests lie in the legal issues of the relationships between injuries and diseases leading to impairment or death. Dr. Lee also serves as the director for the Korean National Institute of Bioethics Policy and is a member of the Republic of Korea's Presidential Committee of Bioethics. He is formerly the commissioner of the Korean Medical Association's Ethics Committee. Please welcome Yoon-seong Lee.
Yes, I'm Yoon-seong Lee. I teach in Seoul National University College of Medicine. I came here with 7 other delegates from Korea, where it is now about 3:30 a.m. and where the Korean language is spoken. Okay. I'd like to avoid the delve into the detailed policy options. With the title of Ownership of Life, it is somewhat religious. Anyway, I will focus on the patenting human genes and cell lines. As we know, the contemporary biotechnologies can only emerge and flourish within the economic market. And biotechnology is a form of enterprise inseparable from modern capitalism, so-called biocapital. In particular, patenting the human genes and cells played a significant role in the development of the biotechnology industries. Without patents, the biotech industry could not have flourished, at least in the United States. Patents can provide some assurance to worrying investors. Patenting has been regarded as promoting biomedical research and development of new diagnoses and treatments, which provided the incentives for investigators and investors and gave the opportunities for accessing knowledge. Biotech patents have little public attention compared with gene-modified food or stem cells. However, patenting life or patenting of human genes and cell lines provoked many questions of whether it is acceptable, which can be patented, and who owns the genes and cells. In general, any invention which is new, useful, and not obvious could be patented. But not everything is patentable. For example, discoveries are not patent eligible, as scientific theories and formulas cannot be patented. human gene patent should be perceived primarily as a discovery or an invention. Many claims that if human genes are isolated from its natural environment and modified, they can be inventions. This view was accepted by the court since the Chakrabarti case in 1980. But the distinction between discovery and invention is not always obvious. It is a seamless continuum rather than classifying a patent as either a discovery or an invention. Conventional wisdom prevailed before Myriad genetic case in 2013. Myriad Genetic has long since held a monopoly on the genetic testing on breast cancer through the patents on the two genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2. But the ruling of the United States Supreme Court invalidates all such claims on natural human gene sequences, some 4,000 of which has been patented, stating a naturally occurring DNA segment is a product of nature and not patent eligible merely because it has been isolated. However, the court still upheld the Myriad's patents on the BRCA gene complementary DNA sequences. There are debates whether complementary DNA is product of nature or invention. Another landmark case, Moore versus UCLA in 1990s, researchers of UCLA developed a cell line from Moore's diseased spleen without the proper consent. The California Supreme Court ruled that the ownership rights was granted to the researchers, not the patient. The patient was granted the informational right instead, for example, right for informed consent. Since then, gene patents granted the inventor right over all future application of a gene. This led to the justification of a monopoly or exploitation of a biotech company or researchers about numerous human genes as well as cells. Another case is Greenberg versus Miami Children's Hospital Research Institute, but I will skip this slide of the prenatal test on Canavan disease because the lawsuit was solved with a sealed out-of-court settlement. So, gene patent rests on a dubious foundation. Patent system is criticized to be instrumental in exacerbating an uneven distribution of health services. And it is not clear whether the rights on the human gene can be transferred to another. There is strong claims that the genes could be regarded as a common property. Also, it is not clear how great a value to place on the work of researchers or companies, not just researcher work, but also the knowledge and technology already assimilated and necessary to develop it. Biotechnology patents have attracted relatively little public attention, although they are ethically controversial. It is partly because judicial decisions removed controversial issues from the political debate. As the several cases I have mentioned. My conclusion is what can be patented and who owns life are not only legal questions, but also political and historical issues demanding transparency and open discussion about what lives we want. Engagement not only from experts or lawyers, but also from all citizens. Biotech patents should not be a given property rights. Of course, the problems must be weighed up against the possible advantage of patenting human genes. The possible debate should include the question, like the biotech patents are necessary to develop R&D. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Peng Jin from Emory. So it is my great honor and privilege to introduce Professor Margaret Somerville. Professor Somerville is Samuel Gale Professor of Law, professor in the Faculty of Medicine, and the founding director of the Center for Medicine, Ethics, and Law at McGill University in Canada. She has authored hundreds of articles, book chapters, and comment columns in mainstream mediums on bioethics. So she has received numerous honors and awards, including the Order of Australia and 8 honorary and PhD and doctorate degree. She's a fellow of Royal Society of Canada. In 2003, she was selected as the first recipient of UNESCO Armisina Prize for the Ethics in Science. And in 2013, she was awarded the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal for service in higher education. In her 2012 book entitled The Ethical Imagination, she highlights the need in our society for a shared ethics, which I think is very fit for this particular summit, given the complexity of the bioethics. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Somerville.
Okay, so some time ago I gave a speech called Spacing Out and Spacing In, Searching for the Purple-Pink Middle. When I arrived to give it, a radio station in the place where I was giving it had held a competition that anybody who could guess what the speech was about would get a prize. Anyway, the reason for it is that purple-pink is actually the color of the imagination. And the first point I want to make is one that I made already this morning, and that is that I believe that we must use all our human ways of knowing in deciding what to do with this new biotechnology, and that imagination, although it's certainly not the primary one or the only one, it's a very important way of knowing that we need to use. That said, to pacify my friend and colleague Steven Pinker, reason is essential. And it is a secondary verification mechanism. Now, spacing out and spacing in also reminds us that our exploration of outer space with astrophysics and spacecraft on the one hand, and deep inner space with molecular biology and genetic research on the other, has enormously expanded the spectrum that represents our knowledge. Researching for a speech I gave recently at the International Conference on Global Space Governance, you see ethicists get asked everywhere, made me aware that we can gain insights into how each area should be governed, especially ethically, by asking what parallels between those two explorations are. For instance, issues of ownership, control, and appropriate ethical behavior, especially what we should not do, are being raised in both contexts. And in both contexts, there's puzzlement about what the answers should be. Both raise questions around conflict between individual autonomy and the common good, including questions of who and what constitutes the common, whose good must be protected, and what constitutes that good. Okay. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that in the last few decades, we've recognized that our physical ecosystem is not indestructible. Indeed, it's vulnerable and it can be irreparably damaged, and that we have obligations to future generations with respect to caring for it, that it must be held in trust for them. And the same, I suggest, is true of our metaphysical ecosystem. The values, principles, attitudes, beliefs, shared stories, and so on the basis of which we form our society. Holding our metaphysical ecosystem in trust will require wisdom, wise ethical restraint, the old virtue of prudence, and courage on all our parts, especially the courage to say no when that is ethically required. Doing that can be particularly difficult for scientists for many reasons, especially that they want to do good. There's an old saying in human rights that nowhere are human rights more threatened than when we act purporting to do only good. The kind of trust that is needed is what Yale University psychiatrist and legal philosopher, the late J. Katz, called earned trust, which he distinguished from blind trust. We've changed from trust me because I know what is best and will act in your best interests, that is blind trust, to earned trust. Trust me because I will show that you can trust me. Blind trust can be presumed to be present. Earned trust cannot. Unlike any other humans before us, we hold the power to change life itself in the palm of our collective human hand. So what does earned trust require that we do and don't do with the extraordinary new powers we have from biotechnologies? What does holding life in trust mean that scientists must not do? Now, seeing this is a session about ownership, let's look at the most challenging and fundamental of ownership issues. Do we own life, in particular human life? Our response to this question will determine the ethics, for example, of two examples that have been given this morning. 3 human parent embryos, this is happening in the United Kingdom, and the CRISPR technology and the possibility of designing babies and editing the human germline. If, as many believe, we have obligations to hold the human germline, the essence of human life, in trust for future generations as a common heritage of humankind, both those procedures are unethical and must be prohibited because they alter that germline. So how does whether or not we see ourselves as owning the human germline affect whether or not we will honor this trust? So, first of all, ownership implies property to be owned. The two concepts of ownership and property are intimately and inextricably connected. So what would treating the human germline, or the germlines or genomes of other living beings, as property mean? In classical property law, provided the owner did not otherwise breach the law, such as acting in a way as to be liable in nuisance or negligence, he could exploit his property and had no obligations to protect or not lay waste to it. But there are competing interests when life is treated as property. Berkeley environmental research scientist Professor Joseph Guth, speaking of the ownership of land, notes, and I quote, "The way we accommodate competing interests is embodied in our law, especially the law of property. Through our property laws, we specify both the rights of landowners to use their land for private purposes and their obligations to the community. So what are or should be those private rights and public obligations regarding germlines and genomes? Could some new ideas in relation to the concept of property help us to avoid risks and harms and ethical pitfalls? Cornell University Law School's Progressive Property Group argue, in terms resonating with feminist legal theory and relational concepts, we have to contextualize the reality in which the concept of property is relevant to decide what we are ethically required to do and not to do. So we need to contextualize biotechnologies to develop some ethically balanced positions regarding ownership and property in relation to them. As is often true in doing ethics, that means we need to ask many questions, some of which I've raised already. For instance, what do we owe to future generations? What does respect for individual autonomy require? What does protection of the common good demand? Other questions could include what stances will build up social capital? What position on ownership of biotechnologies does applying virtues ethics indicate we should undertake? When are concepts of ownership or property displaced or irrelevant? Serious need overrides property rights. What approach is needed for the formation and upholding of important shared values? We also need to recognize that not everyone's basic assumptions about ownership are the same. For example, in our Western democracies, we own the land, which can be compared with the foundational informing principle of the Australian Aboriginal culture that the land owns them. The obligations engendered can be quite different. Do we own our germline, or does our germline own us? Does it matter whether we're dealing with property or persons in employing biotechnology? The law has only two categories, persons or property. Where does the germline fit? What about human embryos? Is it acceptable to set up what the London Times called human embryo manufacturing plants? In answering these questions, we can ask ourselves, does being human matter in deciding who are persons and what is and is not property? Slaves were humans, but were property. Slavery, of course, is now prohibited. But parts of a person, organs for transplant, can be treated as property, although often as non-commercial property for ethical reasons. Non-humans, ships, airplanes, corporations, can be legal persons. The change from speaking of owning animals to speaking of our being their guardians is consistent with the idea that animals are not property, or at least not just property in the same category as other non-living entities. Recently, we've seen the emergence of concepts of non-human persons, a term applied to the great apes. In fact, later this week, there's a case in the New York court to decide whether an ape will be released from one of the New York universities under a writ of habeas corpus. And there's also suggestions for what Professor Peter Singer at Princeton is calling human non-persons. That is, people who don't have the attributes that he would require in order to be seen as a person. So finally, what concepts might help us to deal with biotechnologies ethically, especially the essence of human life, the human germline? First, I would suggest to you that we need to embed ethics in science from its inception, not as an add-on after the science is done. The pursuit of knowledge, with respectful disagreement with one of our interveners this morning, is not value-free. That means that we have to ask whether we're ethically justified in pursuing that knowledge, whether the funding is ethically acceptable, and many more questions. Second, I think that it matters how we view what we learn from science. We can see science as our sole source of valid knowledge, believing that eventually it will be able to explain everything. This is scientism, and it's perhaps more common among scientists, as one would expect, than among the general population. Or we can stand in amazement, wonder, and awe at what we now know, and with epistemological modesty, experience the insight that as the radius of knowledge expands, the circumference of ignorance increases. The more we know that we don't know, and that mystery of the unknown that science opens up to us is amazing, wonderful, and awesome. I believe that experience changes how we see science and the ethics needed to govern it, especially science that involves intentional intervention on life itself, as is true of biotechnology. I sincerely hope the latter approach, which I want to make clear, is not necessarily associated with religion. You don't have to be religious to think that way. I hope that will prevail. Finally, I have a controversial opinion that we need a concept of the sacred to achieve this. The sacred protects that which must not be laid waste, but protected. This can be a religious sacred for those who are religious, or I suggest a secular sacred for those who are not. When I first suggested this, both the religious and secular people were adamantly opposed to the idea of a secular sacred. The religious ones said I was denigrating the sacred and were furious with me, and the secular people said I was imposing religion on them and were equally furious. As one of my students said to me when the fuss was going on, because this got into the press, you know, Professor Somerville, you might be onto something important when you've managed to have everyone mad at you. So, in conclusion, I would leave you with this proposition, that at least the human germline should be treated as sacred. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. All right, well, those were two wonderful talks. We are now at the point in the summit where I don't have to introduce any of our panelists, which is great. You've seen them all before. So I think this is an important and foundational idea for us, the question of how we're going to think about ownership and property. And our two speakers gave us some wonderful and I think provocative perspectives for us to discuss. So rather than posing a question, I'm going to ask, from the point of view of some of the panelists, how do you think, from your differing perspectives, we address this question of property, of ownership, of what the nature of the germline is? Margot, when we were talking, and you said there's either persons or property, certainly true, but there are some things that seem to fit in between there. Human organs, for example, right? We don't quite treat them as property. They have elements of property, but we try to hold them in a different category. And so part of the question is there cultural space for thinking about germline some other way? So let's start by asking the question in general of our panelists. How do we think about the human germline as something that is either property or not property, and something that needs to be protected in that sacred sense or not? So, Steve, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I'm not sure what it could mean to hold the human germline sacred or to pass it down to future generations, given that all of us are subject to mutations in the normal course of events. I just asked my colleague and friend George how many new mutations are introduced in every generation. He said it's about 30. So it doesn't seem to me that there's any coherent concept of the human germline, given, for one thing, the fact that 7 billion of us all have different genomes, and the fact that each one of us is changing the genome whether we like it or not whenever we have children. Add to that the kind of change in the germline that we introduce through sexual selection. So when I was younger, there were women that I would have been very happy to sleep with who rejected me for one reason or another. Every time they did that, there were certain genes in me that they were editing out of future generations. And we do that whenever we exercise selectivity in who we mate with. So it seems to me that on top of this vast amount of naturally occurring and always churning genetic variation, there isn't any coherent concept of the human germline. And if we do change it so as to weed out certain variants that we all agree are harmful against the background of natural variation, this seems to be not only ethically innocuous, but ethically called for, recommended. In terms of patenting, I don't know a whole lot about patents, but I do know something about copyrights as an author. And here I'm always in two minds. When I want to quote some poetry or song lyrics or a passage, I always curse copyright laws. Damn it, I've got to get in touch with the copyright holder and write them a check. Then as an author, every year I get a check and all these people are paying me to excerpt parts of my what I've written. I say, oh great, copyright law, intellectual property. So the reason I mention this is that I think at least since Thomas Jefferson, I think it's been, who wrote about why and in what form we should have copyright, and I think this also applies to patents. It's always a question of balance. There's an optimal amount of legal protection of intellectual property, including the kind of discoveries that lead to improvements of health and well-being. You want there to be enough patent protection or copyright protection to provide an incentive to new discovery, but not so much that that the knowledge doesn't get reintroduced into the idea pool so that then it becomes the raw material for the next generation of creators. How you arrive at the optimum level of protection, not too onerous, but enough to provide an incentive, I don't know, other than by trial and error and constantly monitoring the results of different patent policies, perhaps in different countries, different eras, or different case studies.
George?
Yes. So I think that organs are a special case right now, but the instant that we can engineer organs the way we would manufacture an artificial heart or kidney or something, they will no longer be special. The reason they're special now is to keep people from stealing or donating organs that they shouldn't. Mm-hmm. So that could change quickly. I think that the critical thing for healthcare and even parenting decisions, if those are made, won't be so much the germline. They will have custody of their children, but the technology that changes either the somatic gene therapy or possibly germline gene therapy, that technology could be quite complex, just like any other machine. Mm-hmm. Life is not particularly exceptional in terms of the amount of creativity that you can put into a machine like CRISPR. There's already a great deal of added value to it, and you can couple together multiple bacterial proteins in new ways that needs to be recognized as it happens to be a machine made of molecules. And that's not just a metaphor, I think. It really is. And we have to recall that the alternative to patenting is not open access. It's the opposite. Patenting is a mechanism of obtaining open access because the alternative is trade secret. And trade secrets are bad enough when you're talking about, it's not like copyright. Copyright is all out there anyway by definition. But with patenting, you can make a black box that does a certain thing that's really hard to figure out how it works, because the less protection you have, the more complicated people will make it so that you can't tell what's inside of it. And this, I think, is a very bad idea for biology. It makes things much less safe, much less transparent, much more subject to bad practices.
Thanks. So one of the things that everyone brought up in past sessions, and this one is the importance of definitions. And we are now at that moment where I think people in the public are getting confused by the definitions and by the language that we use to talk about these things. They're getting confused by what it means to edit the germline. They're getting confused by talking about who owns life. If you ask the average person about who owns life, they think about ownership of persons, individuals, not ownerships of these biological products. So one of the questions that's concerned me is, do we need a new vocabulary? I mean, when you asked a question that I think we need to ask, which is, what do we mean by owning or not owning the germline? And what do we mean by, if we talk about not owning the germline or not owning life or holding that sacred, Margot, what do we mean by that? We certainly don't mean not letting it alter. As Steve pointed out, it alters in every generation and in each of us. What does protection of a germline look like? Let's start with that question, Margot.
Well, I'd like to reply to what,
Yes, go ahead.
Stephen said, actually. You know, there's a difference between chance and choice. And yes, the germline does alter all the time, but by chance, not by choice. And Hans Jonas, very famous philosopher, late Hans Jonas, he said, we each have a right to our own unique ticket in the great genetic lottery of the passing on of life. And I think that's what we mean by saying chance is, we've got a right to come into existence through chance. And I agree that the idea that we could cure terrible diseases or avoid them and reduce suffering is enormously important. But the question is that important enough that we would intervene on this fundamental reality, which is us? And Jürgen Habermas, in his book, The Future of Human Nature, and surprisingly for me, actually, because he argues against any alteration of the human germline, and he does it on two bases, that in order to be free, we have to have a concept that we had non-contingent origins, that is, that we came into existence by chance, because he said that gives us the feeling that we can always go back and remake ourselves. So he says that the baby that's been designed is not free, and he also says it's not equal because the designed product is never equal to the designer. And I went on from that in one of the books I wrote, where I looked at, well, freedom and equality are the foundations of democracy. So if we're going to say we're going to create these people according to our own designs, we actually have to start looking at democratic institutions and saying, you know, are we undermining that? Because really, you haven't got and I mean, particularly in the United States, you have such an emphasis on freedom of every individual citizen. And so we're talking about those things. We're not just talking about what we're doing to an individual and whether that's going to be better for them. It probably will be. But what we have to ask in all of these ethical questions, we've got to do a multi-level analysis. What are the harms, benefits for the individual? What are they for institutions, the meso level? What are they for the particular society? And today, as our title of this conference says, what do they mean for our global reality if we start doing this?
Okay. So let's move back for a minute, and then we can come back to this. So let's move away from bioengineering the human germline. Let's start with animals. So are we all okay with ownership? And of course, this will then raise questions of justice and fair distribution and all of that. But are we all okay with the concept of the ownership of designed microorganisms, designed simple animals, designed complex animals, designed mammals for production in agriculture and drug manufacturing? Are we okay with designing, altering the germlines using constructive synthetic biology and other genomic constructive technologies to create new organisms up to some, and we don't need to debate where this is, to some line where we think above that whether it's apes or whether it's some other organism, let's not discuss that. But are we okay with that concept of the ownership of these organisms up to some line, whatever it is, where above that it violates something in us perhaps? But at that simple level, can we start with the agreement that it's perfectly okay to design an organism and own it, whether that organism is a bacterium or whether that organism is a flock of sheep whose milk express a pharmaceutical molecule that we want to manufacture? Anybody want to answer that question?
Well, I think that I'm a vegan, so I'll present my quirky point of view on this. I think that we can, even apes, if we're doing something in their best interests and there is appropriate oversight on that, if they're an endangered species, and in fact the apes are not in great shape worldwide, that might be a valuable invention. Now, whether you own those apes or whether you're just helping them survive is maybe is something we don't even have to address. The point is that there are legal matters as to who has to pay for their food and who gets to reap rewards from making them available to the public. And the same thing applies to children to some extent. There are parents who put their children on display in movies and whatnot, and they, in a certain sense, own them economically until they're of age. And I think that, back to the question of whether we are equal to our children, I think education is another matter, just like germline manipulation. I hope that when I educate my students on my children, they are better than me. That's the point. And if I were to cure one of my diseases in my child, I would hope that that child would be healthier than I am. So I think that this exceptionalism of DNA is a very curious phenomenon.
So, Yoon-seong, do we see, are these kinds of conversations and these kinds of questions discussed differently in your country? Or are we having the same conversation that you have, albeit in a different language?
Yes, yes, basically the same, but there's some differences in the law system. For example, in Korea, the human body after death is not treated as a property, neither a person. In between, there is a special definition for the human bodies. And also, before death, before birth, the fetus is not a person, and nor it's a property. So the special law regulates the fetus embryo. I don't know exactly about this germline, but and the human body after death, we regulate special laws. So. I think it is the ownership is the defined ownership is very difficult. So my recommendation is, do not decide here. Yes, let's talk about, and that open discussion is needed. Participating the all citizens is needed. That's my
Yeah, just to say, actually, that's very interesting because in English common law, you have possession of a dead body, but you cannot own a dead body. And what is interesting about that is that the possession brings obligations, but no rights.
That's interesting.
I see. But for example, stealing the human body from the funeral home or the cemetery, that cannot be constituted of a theft. It's a humiliation of the humiliation of the corpse.
Right.
Okay, but
desecration of corpse, we say.
Yeah.
Desecration.
Yes, but the human body used in the art school as the model of the anatomy sessions. If you steal that human body, that constitutes a theft. Because some differences. Okay.
So before I move on to the question of justice, I just do want to push back a little bit on George on what you said. So, you claim that it isn't open access or patenting. Of course, that is under a model of corporate structure that we have now. There is a big push in science in general towards all kinds of open access of publications, open access of data, open access of information that seems to be counter to the idea that open access would necessarily cause secrecy in corporations. So, I mean, do we take it for granted that the system stays the way it is and therefore patenting is the best way to think about corporations? Or do we have an obligation, if we feel this is true, and it's an open question, to say that the system that we have set up, the corporate system that we have set up, is itself problematic, and we actually need to try to get the development of these technologies to look more like big science and to look more like open access, rather than simply saying, well, you know, the patent system is there and that's the best way we should handle this.
Yeah. Well, I'm always looking for innovation. I think in this particular case, I haven't heard of a innovative or tripped one up myself yet, where if you eliminated the patent system tomorrow, what would happen is all this open access that academics participate, including my group is one of the most radically open access. Yeah. Stephen Pinker and I are in our medical records are online. Right. If you got rid of it tomorrow, what would happen is before they published any open access paper, they'd take it into a company. The company would start developing the trade secrets, and they would publish as little as possible in the open access if it's valuable. If they need to protect it in order to cure patients, for example, the curing of the patients and the money would trump the open access, right. Almost certainly. So if you're going to be creative about this, you need to keep that trade secret option in mind.
And we saw a little bit of that in the beginning with gene patenting, right? Because when gene patenting became something that was possible, groups went out and quickly tried to patent all the genes they could. If it had been a complete open access, and their argument was, in fact, that otherwise there wouldn't be an incentive to begin to develop, technologies around that. I mean, Myriad Genetics has put the case has put a monkey wrench in that, but that was the exact argument for the patenting of genes. So there is some tension there around human products. I'm not disagreeing with you necessarily. I'm just saying that there is some room there. I think gene patenting has become the kind of paradigmatic example of the limits of the patent claim in biotechnology.
Well, in the case of the gene patents, they did make the sequences public, which they wouldn't have otherwise done. And the patenting of the genes was distinguished in how useless it was. That is to say, they didn't actually assemble a machine, molecular or otherwise, that was non-obvious. But it did force them to put it into the public domain. Right. Other people, including Myriad, had much more complicated patents than the one that was rejected by the Supreme Court. The cDNA was just one, slightly more complicated, but they're even more complicated, where they describe exactly how to sequence it and the machine you need to sequence it and the way you interpret it and all that sort of stuff. And that is adding value to it, and that's what would have been trade secret otherwise. But just the patenting of a gene, that doesn't actually tell you how to do a diagnostic or a therapeutic, for example.
Jeff, as someone who's an expert in global health and thinks about the impact of health technologies and issues throughout the world, when you hear an argument about ownership, about patenting, about intellectual property of these technologies, and then we take the next step and we move to the impact of those things on social justice, on distribution throughout the world, there are, of course, both sides of that argument. The argument that, in fact, one of the best ways to distribute these is to allow companies to develop them quickly because of a profit motive to develop them quickly and then create ways to distribute them. And then there's the kind of counter argument that concentrates wealth in developed countries, exploits the less developed countries. So, we are moving into we're already in an era where we're sending technologies into developing areas and using those to treat disease. But how do you, from your perspective, as you look across different cultures and public health efforts to try to eradicate disease, how do you think about these technologies in terms of ownership, patenting, and distributive justice?
Skeptically and critically.
Say a little more.
I think there's the opportunity for great good, obviously, from these technologies, and we have a number of vaccines that are out that are good examples of that, and increasingly useful ones, although they often require international help to fund them. But those mechanisms have been put in place, and I think there are more people in the world getting more effective preventive approaches than has occurred in previous history. By the same token, a good chunk of biotechnology will only increase the gap between the haves and have-nots. Probably you don't even have to go. Global health can be present within about 200 meters of this building as well. And so probably that there will be an increasing separation between haves and have-nots in the use of much of this biotechnology.
All right, so we're going to wrap up our panel now. Would anyone like to make any final comments or reactions to things they've heard? No obligation, Steve?
A couple of things. One of those, I'm wondering if the gap between the haves and have-nots should really be a major ethical concern compared to the welfare of the have-nots. Because one way you could reduce the gaps between the haves and the have-nots is just confiscate all the medical technology available to the haves. You'd bring them back down to the level of the have-nots. It's not clear that that would make the world a better place. On the other hand, we have seen repeatedly that life-saving innovations that do begin with the haves, such as Europe and the Americas, do spread globally. The graph that I showed this morning showed that there were massive gaps between Europe and the Americans on the one hand and Asia and Africa on the other, which have radically narrowed. And so there would seem to be an argument to be concerned about the have-nots, but to forget about the gap, because gaps like that inevitably narrow. Also, I appreciate that Margot laid out what I think is our a major ethical choice, namely when Margot weighed the advantage of reducing death and suffering against the sacredness of random passing down of genes to certain design choices. That is, would we be sacrificing the inherent contingency of being a human and having a genome that no one thought about at the cost of more people suffering and dying? For me, that's a no-brainer. Yeah, sacrifice it. It's better that fewer people die and suffer compared to a principle which I consider kind of nebulous and very hard to justify, whereas saving lives and improving health is very easy to justify.
But I think we have to take into account the initial use of most technologies, in fact, most things that cause problems in ethics. Usually we've got a very, very good reason to do the first step, and that's what Stephen is setting up. And I agree with you, and it's a tough choice to make, to say, no, I won't do what's necessary to reduce that suffering. But you have to look where this goes, and it goes into, first of all, possibly enhancement technologies, which are a concern. And there's also been a suggestion, although it was a while ago and it isn't spoken about now, but if, say, we were able to make a much more intelligent human race, then the argument is there'd be lots of jobs that still needed to be done that those humans wouldn't want to do. So in one of the Australian reports, there was a section on disenhancement as to whether we would create a sub-intelligent group of humans who would be quite happy to do those jobs. And I think we have to take into account the it's very nebulous. I agree with you about that. It's not something concrete that you can put your hands on, and relieving suffering is, and that's why the relieving suffering argument is so powerful when you're faced with the sort of thing that I'm talking about, where I'm saying, hey, wait a minute, where do you think this will end up? The basic question is, what shouldn't we do? Because if we do it, we will hand on a world where no reasonable person would want to live. Now, maybe Stephen's right, that they would rather live in a world that didn't have suffering, but would they want to live in a world where you weren't this unique individual, for example, but you had been designed by someone else? And that's what we're talking about.
All right, I'm not going to let us debate that. That's a great question to leave hanging. It's an important question. Did anyone else want to say anything else before we dismiss? So let's thank the panel for their time and attention. And I invite you to go sit.